The lantern light hit her face like an accusation. Alma Rhodes stood in the freezing October dark, her traveling trunk at her feet, and her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, staring at a man she had never seen before in her life. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same red rock that jutted out of the Kansas plains behind him. His dark eyes held the lantern's flame in two small, burning points, and he was staring at her with an expression she could not immediately read, not hostility, not welcome, but something suspended between the two, something careful and wary and deeply, deeply guarded. "You are not Hank Bellamy," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was a small miracle given that she had traveled 4 days on a stagecoach that smelled like wet wool and unwashed men, given that the driver had dropped her at a fork in the road and pointed vaguely east and told her the Bellamy homestead was maybe a mile off, given that she had walked that mile alone in the dark with her trunk scraping dirt, guided by nothing but the distant flicker of this very lantern. "No," the man said, "I am not," she swallowed. "This is not the Bellamy homestead." "No," he said again, and now she heard something shift in his voice, something that might have been pity if it had not also carried a note of something harder, something that sounded like a man who had learned long ago that surprises arriving in the dark were rarely good ones. "This is the Carson property. Joel Carson." He paused. "You have walked about 3 miles in the wrong direction, ma'am." The betrayal of it hit her like a physical force. 3 miles. The stagecoach driver, a man named Cutler who had been paid a full fare to deliver her safely to the Bellamy homestead, had sent her 3 miles in the wrong direction in the pitch dark of an October night on the Kansas frontier. Everything she had planned, every careful arrangement, the letters exchanged over 3 months, the agreement struck, the life she had been promised, all of it suddenly felt as fragile as the flame inside that lantern. Her knees did not buckle. She was proud of that later, but she did put one hand out to steady herself against her own traveling trunk, and the man Joel Carson noticed, because his whole posture changed. The wariness did not leave him entirely, but something else moved through his expression, something human and instinctive, and he stepped forward and held the lantern higher. "Come inside," he said, "before you freeze." She wanted to refuse. Every cautious instinct she possessed, every lesson her mother had driven into her about the dark motives of strange men in isolated places, rose up in her chest. But the wind off the prairie was vicious and cold, and she could not feel her fingers anymore, and the darkness behind her was absolute, and Alma Rhodes had not survived 26 years by letting pride make her decisions. She picked up her trunk. "Leave it," he said. "I will bring it." She left it. That was the moment everything changed, though she would not understand that for weeks yet. She walked through the door of the wrong homestead, and the right rancher closed it gently behind her, and the darkness outside was shut out, and the warmth inside was the most welcome thing she had felt in longer than she cared to admit. To understand how Alma Rhodes came to be standing on a stranger's porch in Kansas in October of 1873, you have to go back 6 months, to a rooming house in Cincinnati, where she had been living for 3 years on what her landlady charitably called a schoolteacher's wage, and what Alma herself privately called barely enough to keep the wolves from the door. She had come to Cincinnati from Pennsylvania at 23, following a teaching position that had materialized through a church connection, carrying 2 dresses, a trunk of books, and the absolute certainty that she was going to build something for herself. Her parents were gone, her father to a factory accident when she was 17, her mother to pneumonia 2 years later, and she had no siblings and no suitors, which at 23 had felt like freedom, and at 25 had begun to feel like something more complicated. The school was real, and the children were genuinely good, and she had loved the work. But Cincinnati was expensive and crowded, and full of a particular kind of city noise that wore at her in ways she could not always name. She missed open land. She missed silence that was not simply the absence of conversation, but the presence of something larger and quieter and more honest. She had grown up on her father's small farm in western Pennsylvania, and some deep part of her had never stopped being the girl who walked fence lines at dawn and knew every hawk that nested in the upper pasture. When the advertisement came to her, brought by a colleague named Mrs. Whitmore, who clipped marriage notices from Western newspapers for reasons that were never entirely clear, Alma read it 3 times. It said, in plain, unadorned language, "Seeking a wife of sound character and practical disposition. I own 160 acres of good Kansas grassland, a clean house, and a productive herd. I am not a young man, but not an old one either. I do not drink to excess. I would like a partner in this life, someone willing to work beside me and be treated with full respect. If this interests you, write to Henry Bellamy, Dodge City County, Kansas." What interested Alma was not the land or the cattle or even the promise of respect, though that last part was the most unusual thing she had seen in such an advertisement. What interested her was the phrase, "a partner in this life." Not a housekeeper, not a woman to bear children and cook meals and be grateful for shelter. A partner. She wrote back. Henry Bellamy's letters were practical and somewhat stilted, but never dishonest, or so she believed. He described his property. He described his days. He mentioned, almost in passing, that he had been married before and that his wife had passed 3 years ago, and that the house had felt large and wrong ever since. He mentioned a dog named Copper. He mentioned that his nearest neighbor was a rancher named Carson who ran cattle and kept mostly to himself, and that there was a decent church 12 miles east and a general store 7 miles south, and that the winters were hard but the springs were extraordinary. Alma made her decision in March. She gave her notice at the school in April. She arranged her travel in September and departed Cincinnati on the 2nd of October, 1873, on a series of trains and then a stagecoach, carrying everything she owned in one large trunk and one carpetbag, heading toward a man she had never met and a life she had never lived and a landscape that was, she told herself, going to feel like coming home. The stagecoach driver, Cutler, was a red-faced man in his 50s, with a long grievance against the world that he expressed through the handling of the horses and the dispensing of inaccurate directions. He dropped her at the fork in the pitch dark just before 9 o'clock in the evening and pointed east and said, "Bellamy's is about a mile that way, can't miss it." And she had believed him because she had no reason not to, and because the darkness was already pressing in and she was exhausted in every bone of her body. The mile became 3. The lights she saw in the distance were not Henry Bellamy's lamps. They were Joel Carson's. Inside the Carson house, which was warmer than she expected and cleaner than she expected, and somehow larger than the outside had suggested, Alma stood near the fireplace and pressed her hands together, and tried to think clearly while Joel Carson set her trunk down beside the door with considerably less effort than she had managed dragging it across 3 miles of prairie. He was, she estimated, somewhere around 30, maybe 32. He moved with the unhurried economy of a man who had learned to conserve effort over years of hard physical work, and there was nothing wasted or theatrical about him. He set the trunk down, stood straight, and looked at her without any of the hungry or calculating assessment she had steeled herself against. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," she said. "Cold and no, not hurt." "Sit down," he said, and gestured to a chair near the fire, and then went to the stove without waiting for her response, and she heard the sound of water being poured and the creak of a kettle being positioned. She sat. The chair was solid and the fire was real, and the room smelled of wood smoke and leather, and something faintly like dried sage, and Alma let herself breathe properly for the first time in what felt like hours. The room was sparsely furnished but carefully arranged, a man living alone who had not given up on order. There was a table with 2 chairs, a cabinet against one wall, a small bookshelf that she noticed with a small, involuntary brightening of her attention. A hat hung on a peg by the door. A pair of boots, well worn and clean, stood against the baseboard. There were no frills, no decorative things, nothing soft except a wool blanket folded over the back of the chair she sat in, which she now realized was an implicit invitation she had accepted without noticing. "You came to marry Bellamy," Joel said from across the room. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she heard the kettle beginning to heat. "And you did not know he had died." The words arrived in the room like a stone dropped into still water, and every ripple went outward from her and hit every wall at once. "What?" she said. Joel turned. In the firelight, his face held an expression she recognized only later, looking back, as the face of a man who deeply regretted being the one who had to say a thing. "Henry Bellamy died 6 weeks ago," he said. "Fever. It came on fast. There was no way to get word to you in time if letters were already in transit." Alma did not speak for a very long time. She heard the kettle sing. She watched the fire. She thought about 37 letters she had written and received. She thought about the phrase, "a partner in this life." She thought about her empty room in Cincinnati, already relet to another tenant. She thought about her trunk beside the door, which contained literally everything she owned. She thought about the prairies she had looked at through the train window for 2 days, vast and golden and absolutely indifferent, and how she had thought, "I could live here. I could be someone here." She thought about the fact that she had nowhere to go. "I did not know," she said finally, and her voice was very quiet and very controlled and cost her considerably more than it sounded. "No," Joel said gently. "I did not think you did." He brought her the tea. It was plain black tea, strong and hot, and he set it on the small table beside her chair without comment or ceremony, and that small, practical act of kindness was, in that moment, the most important thing anyone had done for her in a very long time. "What happens to his property?" she asked, because she was a practical woman and practical questions were what she had to anchor herself to right now. "He had a brother in Missouri," Joel said, sitting in the other chair at a respectful distance, elbows on his knees, hands loose. "The land and stock will go to him. The house, too." He paused. "There is no claim you could make. I am sorry." "I am not looking for a claim," she said, with perhaps more sharpness than she intended, and then more quietly. "I am just trying to understand what my situation is." "Your situation," Joel said carefully, "is that it is the middle of the night and it is cold and you have nowhere to go until morning. After that we can figure out the rest." She looked at him then, really looked at him, with the same directness she had always used with people she was trying to measure, the habit of a woman who had learned to read character quickly, because she could not afford the cost of reading it wrong. What she saw was a face that had been weathered by years of outdoor work, with deep-set dark eyes that held no hidden agenda she could detect, a mouth that was set in a serious line but not an unkind one, and the general quality of a man who had chosen honesty over comfort and was not going to stop now. "I cannot stay here," she said. "It would not be appropriate." "No," he agreed, immediately and without any trace of argument or wounded pride, and that too, she noted. "There is a decent widow woman in town, a Mrs. Hadley, who takes in boarders. I can take you there in the morning. Tonight," he paused, and she could see him thinking carefully. "My hired hand has a room in the barn that is separate and private. It is clean. He is away until next week. You would have the latch on the inside." It was the most thoughtful version of a difficult offer she could have imagined, and she recognized it as such. "Thank you," she said. "I accept." She finished the tea. He showed her to the hand's room in the barn, which was, in fact, clean, with a cot and a washstand and a proper latch. And he carried her trunk without being asked, set it inside, and said good night, and closed the door, and she heard his footsteps retreating back toward the house, and then nothing but the sound of horses shifting in the dark stalls beyond the thin wooden partition and the wind moving over the prairie outside. Alma sat on the edge of the cot for a long time. Then she lay down, fully clothed under a wool blanket, and stared at the dark ceiling, and thought about the specific shape of a life that has been entirely overturned in the space of one evening. And after a while, exhaustion made the decision for her, and she slept. In the morning, the world looked different, as mornings in the West always tended to enormous and clear and lit, with a quality of light that had no equivalent anywhere east of the Mississippi. A golden, generous light that fell over everything without prejudice or exception, and made even catastrophe look briefly comprehensible. Alma washed her face at the washstand, changed into her second dress, which was slightly less travel-worn than the first, and braided her dark hair and pinned it up and took 3 slow breaths, and then she opened the barn door and walked out into the morning. Joel Carson was in the yard, splitting wood. He had his coat off despite the cold and was working with the steady, unhurried rhythm she had already noticed in him, and he did not hear her immediately. And for a moment she watched him without his awareness, which was a thing she would have been embarrassed to be caught doing, but which she allowed herself in that brief, unobserved moment, because something in the straightforward physicality of the work, the lack of performance in it, felt honest in a way she needed to see just then. He looked up, registered her, set the axe against the block, and reached for his coat. "Morning," he said. "Are you hungry?" She was starving, as it turned out. He made eggs and cornbread on the stove with the same unhurried efficiency he brought to everything else, and she sat at the table in his kitchen and ate more than she had eaten in 4 days on the road, and they talked carefully at first, and then with increasing directness, the way 2 honest people inevitably end up talking when there is nothing to pretend about. He had been on this land for 4 years, he told her. He had come from Texas, from a cattle-driving background, and had saved enough to buy this acreage and start his own herd, which now ran to about 60 head with good prospects for the next season. He was 29 years old. He had no family within 1,000 miles. He had known Henry Bellamy as a neighbor and had considered him a decent man and had been genuinely grieved by his sudden death. She told him about Cincinnati, about the school, about the letters and what had drawn her to them. She did not perform distress about her situation, and she did not minimize it either. She laid it out plainly. She had given up her room and her position. She had less than $8 in her purse, and she was in a place she did not know, with no plan and no connections. Joel listened without interrupting, which was unusual enough in her experience of men that she noted it. "Mrs. Hadley in town does take boarders," he said when she had finished. "The rate is fair. You might also find work there. The school lost its teacher in the spring and they have been making do since. A woman with your experience, you know the town well," she said. "I know what matters in it," he said simply. "I tend to pay attention to what matters." She looked at him across the table. "And what matters here?" He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee mug slowly in his hands. "People who keep their word," he said. "People who do not pretend things are other than they are. Work that is honest, land that is treated with respect." He paused. "Not complicated things mostly, but not small ones either." Alma felt something in her chest that she could not immediately name, not attraction, not yet, but something adjacent to it, something like recognition, as if someone had said a thing she had believed for a long time out loud for the first time. He drove her to town that morning in a buckboard wagon, with her trunk in the back and the Kansas sky enormous and blue overhead, and the prairie grass still carrying the last of its autumn gold, and he did not try to fill the silence with noise, and she found that she did not need him to. Mrs. Hadley was a brisk, sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who had been widowed by a Comanche raid 12 years ago, and had rebuilt her life with a ferocity that was still visible in the set of her jaw. She looked Alma up and down with the thoroughness of a horse buyer, and apparently liked what she saw, because her rate was fair, and she had a room available starting immediately. "You the woman who was supposed to marry Henry Bellamy?" she asked, with the directness of someone who considered tact a luxury. "Yes," Alma said. Mrs. Hadley shook her head. "Terrible business. He was not a bad man, not the most exciting one either, God rest him." She paused. "You planning to stay or go?" Alma looked at the town around her, a main street with a general store, a blacksmith, a small church, a feed and grain establishment, a post office, a modest hotel, a building that appeared to serve simultaneously as town meeting place and schoolroom. Flat land in every direction, enormous sky, a quality of silence between the buildings that was not emptiness but space. Her chest opened in a way that her chest had not opened in 3 years in Cincinnati. "Stay," she said, "if I can find work." Mrs. Hadley looked at Joel, who was still standing beside his wagon. "You brought her," she said. It was not an accusation. It was an observation about responsibility. "She arrived at my door," he said. "There was nowhere else to bring her." Mrs. Hadley made a sound that might have been satisfaction. "Well," she said, "the school board meets Thursday." The school board met Thursday. Alma sat before 4 men who were farmers and ranchers and the town pastor, and she answered their questions with the directness and competence of a woman who had spent 3 years teaching children in a Cincinnati school and knew exactly what she was worth. And by the end of that meeting, she had a position starting the following Monday and a salary that was modest but sufficient. And she walked out of the town meeting hall into the clear Kansas afternoon and stood on the wooden sidewalk and breathed in and breathed out and felt the very first small, tentative shoots of something that might eventually become a new life. She did not see Joel Carson for 9 days after that. She told herself she was not counting. She was, in fact, counting. He came to town for supplies on a Wednesday, and she was coming out of the general store with a small parcel of her own when she nearly walked directly into him. And the way his face changed when he saw her, the flash of something unguarded and immediate before the careful expression was replaced, she caught it and she remembered it. "Miss Rhodes," he said. "Mr. Carson," she said. "How are your cattle?" He blinked at the directness of it, and then the corner of his mouth moved in what she was already beginning to recognize as the closest thing he had to an open smile. "Better than last week," he said. "2 more calves. The Hereford cross I was hoping for." "Then it is a good week," she said. "And the school?" 14 children," she said, "ranging from 6 to 13 with 3 different reading levels and a complete absence of arithmetic knowledge above simple sums, and the most wonderful collection of curiosity I have ever encountered in a classroom. So yes, also a good week." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not entirely read, not yet, because she was still learning the vocabulary of his face, which was not a generous one in terms of visible emotion, but which rewarded attention. "I am glad," he said, and she heard something in it that was more than social courtesy, something personal and genuine, and it settled in her chest and stayed there. They talked for perhaps 15 minutes on the sidewalk outside the general store, with horses tied to the rail and dust moving lazily down the street, and the smell of autumn and horsehide and wood smoke in the air. And they talked about the town and the school and the winter coming. And at no point did either of them say anything that could be called intimate or forward or even particularly significant. And yet when he tipped his hat and climbed back onto his wagon and drove away, Alma stood for a moment longer than was quite warranted and watched the wagon diminish down the street. Mrs. Hadley, who had a terrible and unassuming habit of appearing in doorways at inconvenient moments, said from behind Alma's left shoulder, "He is a good man, Carson." "Yes," Alma said, "I expect he is." "Quiet," Mrs. Hadley said. "Some women cannot abide it." "I have never found that silence was the problem," Alma said. "It is dishonesty that I cannot abide." Mrs. Hadley made her sound of satisfaction again. She said, "Then you might suit each other after all." Alma turned around, but Mrs. Hadley had already gone back inside. She went back to her room and sat on the edge of her narrow bed and thought about the word suit, and what it meant, and whether she was already in danger of wanting something she had not given herself permission to want, because she had come here for a practical purpose, and the practical purpose had been removed, and she was now in the process of building something genuinely her own. And she was not at all certain she could trust the particular warmth in her chest when she thought about a quiet man with dark eyes who had carried her trunk without being asked, and made her tea in the middle of the night without making her feel like a burden for needing it. She told herself to be sensible. She was sensible for approximately 2.5 weeks. It was the books that undid her, really. She had noticed the small bookshelf in Joel's house that first night and cataloged it in the way that readers always catalog the shelves of other people, the way you read the book someone owns as a form of reading the person themselves. She had not been able to see the titles clearly in the firelight, and she had thought about it intermittently in the following weeks in the way you think about an unanswered question. When he appeared at the schoolhouse door one afternoon in November to return a primer he had borrowed from the school board 2 years ago and apparently forgotten, a man who borrowed reading materials was already interesting. She asked him about his books, because she was a school teacher and asking about books was entirely professional and had nothing whatsoever to do with anything else. He told her. He had a history of the American frontier, which he had read 3 times and argued with extensively on the margins. He had a collection of Shakespeare's plays, which he had acquired in Texas from a traveling company of actors who needed food more than books and had traded accordingly. He had 2 novels, Great Expectations and a battered copy of Moby Dick, and a surveying manual and a veterinary guide and a book on the grasses of the American plains that he had bought specifically because he wanted to understand the land he was going to live on. "You annotate Shakespeare," she said. "I have opinions about some of the choices," he said, without any defensiveness. "What kind of opinions?" He looked at her with a quality of attention that was by now familiar but had not become less acute. "Come and look," he said, "if you are interested. Sunday, if you have no other obligation, I can show you." It was not a hidden invitation. It was entirely literal. And yet Alma's heart did exactly something that hearts do when they have already made a decision the conscious mind has not yet caught up with. "Sunday," she said. "Yes, all right." She went Sunday. He made coffee and they sat at the table with the Shakespeare open between them, and he showed her his marginal notes, which were dense and careful, and argued back against the text, with a specific kind of intelligence that is only developed by people who have spent years reading in isolation and talking to no one and therefore have had to conduct the entire conversation themselves. She laughed out loud twice. He looked startled both times, as if laughter in his house was an animal that had not visited recently, and both times the startled expression became something else, something open and warm and just slightly undone. She rode back to town in the evening in a wagon driven by a neighboring farmer who passed through on Sundays, and she did not tell Mrs. Hadley anything because there was nothing to tell, nothing that had been said or done that was not entirely proper, and yet she sat at her writing table that night and tried to grade arithmetic papers, and found that she was instead staring at the lamp flame and thinking about the particular quality of a man's attention when it is genuinely interested and not merely performing interest. This became a pattern. Sunday afternoons at the Carson property. Reading, or discussing what they had read, or walking the fence line while he checked posts, and she watched the hawks, or sitting on the porch in the last week warmth of the November sun, while the prairie spread out in every direction, and the silence between them was comfortable in a way that silences between 2 people only become when something real is happening. He was not a man who offered himself easily. She understood that. The careful economy of his self-disclosure was not coldness, and it was not concealment. It was more like the behavior of someone who had learned that people leave, and who was therefore very measured about what he gave away. She respected it. She had her own version of it, the learned caution of a woman who had been entirely alone for 3 years and had built her survival on her own competence and did not intend to make herself dependent on anyone. They were, she thought sometimes with a private amusement, extremely well matched in their mutual guardedness. 2 people carefully circling something inevitable with the full awareness that it was inevitable and the mutual unspoken agreement to take their time about it anyway. November turned cold in earnest, the school days shortened. Mrs. Hadley taught Alma how to bank a fire for the night, and how to recognize the quality of sky that preceded a real Kansas blizzard, which was different from the quality of sky that preceded ordinary winter, weather in a way that took experience to learn. The first snow came in the second week of November. Not a blizzard, but a serious, meaningful snowfall that covered the prairie in a depth of white that was absolute and transforming, and revealed the landscape as something entirely new. Alma stood at her boarding house window the morning after and watched it, and felt something that was very close to joy. She told Joel about it on Sunday, that particular quality of joy, the transformation of the land from its autumn face to this new one, and he listened to her describe it with an expression she was beginning to understand as his version of being moved, very still, very attentive, a quality of receiving what she said as if it had weight and value. "I have lived here for years," he said, "and I still feel that. The first serious snow." "You never said," she said. "I did not think anyone would want to hear about it," he said simply. It was the most revealing thing he had said to her in weeks, and he seemed to understand that immediately after saying it, because something in his expression shifted, became briefly exposed before the careful neutrality returned. But Alma had seen it. She kept it. "I would always want to hear about it," she said, carefully and precisely, and the silence that followed was not empty but full, fully charged with what had not yet been spoken, but was present in the room between them as certainly as the cold air and the wood smoke and the winter light. The crisis, when it came from outside. His name was Dale Mercer, and he arrived in December with a deed and a lawyer, and a claim that the eastern quarter of Joel's land, about 40 acres, had been double sold by a land office agent in 1871, before Joel had purchased it, and that the original sale had prior legal standing. Mercer was a land speculator from Wichita with a habit of finding these kinds of disputes in newly settled territories and exploiting them, and he had the specific, well-dressed, cold-eyed quality of a man whose dark past was not secret exactly, but was simply never spoken about directly. Joel told Alma about it on Sunday with the flat, measured tone he used for things that were serious, sitting at his table with the deed documents spread out before him. She could see what the documents cost him. 40 acres was not a fortune, but it was the eastern water access, the creek that ran through that corner of the property, and without it the remaining land was significantly harder to work and worth significantly less. She looked at the documents carefully. She was a schoolteacher, not a lawyer, but she was also a woman who had read everything she could get her hands on for 26 years, and she had a specific, well-developed capacity for reading the fine language of official documents and finding the places where the language did not hold. "This agent," she said, "Turner, the one who conducted both sales." "Yes," Joel said. "Is he still at the Dodge City Land Office?" "No, dismissed 2 years ago for irregularities." Joel's voice was carefully level. "Irregularities," Alma repeated. "And is there a record of the dismissal, the specific cause?" He looked at her. "You think there is something in the original sale that does not hold?" "I think a man who was dismissed for irregularities from a land office may have had those irregularities in the very transactions being used against you now," she said. "I think it is worth finding out." He was quiet for a moment. "I cannot leave the cattle in this weather, not for a trip to Dodge City." "I can go," she said. He looked at her with an expression that was part surprise and part something more complex, the look of a man confronting the realization that the person across from him was not in any way decorative or incidental to his life, but fully, substantively necessary. "You would do that," he said. "Why would I not?" she said, with a directness that did not waver. "You have been the only person since I arrived here who has been genuinely kind to me without any hidden motive I can identify. If I can help you, I will." There was a long pause. "Alma," he said, and the use of her first name, the first time he had used it, landed in the room with the particular weight of a thing that is said and cannot be unsaid, a threshold crossed without ceremony but irreversibly. She met his eyes. "Thank you," he said, and it meant considerably more than the words themselves. She went to Dodge City the following Thursday on the weekly post wagon, which was cold and slow but reliable. The land office was a low building on a side street staffed by a harried clerk who did not initially seem inclined to be cooperative. But Alma had dealt with 3 years of Cincinnati school board bureaucrats and was entirely undeterred, and she asked her questions with the pleasant, steady insistence of a woman who had no intention of leaving without the information she needed. The clerk's name was Purvis, and he was fundamentally a decent man who had simply developed the defensive habits of someone who dealt with too many difficult people. And when Alma explained the situation clearly and without hysteria, and pointed out, accurately, that the records of Turner's dismissal would be held in this very office, and that their production would serve the interests of legitimate land ownership in the county, he eventually produced them. Turner had been dismissed for exactly what she suspected: double selling. He had sold the same parcels to multiple buyers, collected fees from both, and filed conflicting paperwork. The original sale to the man Mercer was representing was itself one of Turner's fraudulent transactions, not the legitimate prior claim Mercer's lawyer was presenting it as, but one of several simultaneous fraudulent sales of the same land, which meant no prior legal standing whatsoever. Alma copied the relevant documents in her clear schoolteacher's hand, had Purvis sign and date the copies as accurate representations of the originals, thanked him with genuine warmth, and was back in the post wagon by noon. She arrived back in town on Friday evening and wrote a careful letter to Joel explaining what she had found and sent it with the Saturday morning rider, and his response came back that same afternoon, which meant he had ridden to town himself to receive it and respond immediately. The response said, "Mercer's lawyer took one look at what you found and folded. Mercer has withdrawn the claim. You have saved this property. Please come to Sunday dinner. I would very much like to cook for you. Joel." She read it twice, then read it a third time, and something in her chest made a sound like ice breaking at the end of a long winter. Sunday dinner was roast chicken, which he had clearly taken pains over, and cornbread and preserved beans and a dried apple pie that was slightly uneven on one side but tasted extraordinary. And they ate and talked and laughed more than they usually did, because the release of the tension of the past 2 weeks had taken something with it, some last maintained distance. After dinner they sat by the fire, and the lamp was low and the prairie outside was dark and still, and Joel turned his coffee mug in his hands the way he did when he was working up to something, and she waited. "I have been thinking," he said carefully, "about what I want." "Yes," she said. "I think—" He stopped. Started again. "I came to Kansas to build something that was mine, something real. I have done that more or less. The land, the cattle, the house, and I thought that was enough, that it would feel like enough once I had it." He paused. "It does not feel like enough." Alma was very still. "The house is too quiet," he said. "It has been too quiet for 4 years, and I told myself that was the price of the life I chose and I could live with it." He looked at her, and the careful neutrality in his expression was entirely gone, and what remained was something direct and unguarded and serious and real. "And then you walked up to my door in the dark, and I carried your trunk inside, and I have not been able to convince myself that the quiet is acceptable since." She looked at him across the firelight. Her heart was doing something complex and significant that she intended to pay attention to properly. "I am not," he said, with the particular honesty of a man who is telling the truth even when the truth is complicated, "the most demonstrative person. I know that. I am not easy to know quickly. I have a tendency to go silent when things are hard and to work rather than talk, and I cannot promise I will always say the thing that should be said at the moment it should be said." He paused. "But I can promise that I mean what I say, that I will not deceive you, that the respect I have for you is not going to diminish or become conditional, and that a pause, that I would very much like to stop pretending that what I feel when you are here is simple or casual or ordinary." Alma put her coffee mug down carefully on the small table because her hands were not entirely steady, and she folded her hands in her lap and looked at him and said, "Joel, do you know what I thought The first night I was here. When you made me tea in the middle of the night and put the cup down without making a performance of it, without making me feel like I owed something for it." "No," he said. "I thought this is what a good man looks like," she said. "Not a perfect one, not a showy one, just a good one. And I thought I had probably never been in the same room with one before and was not entirely sure how to behave about it." Something in his face shifted, and the shift was enormous in proportion to its visible scale, the way the change of a few degrees in temperature changes the whole quality of air. "Alma," he said, "I did not come here to fall in love," she said. "That is not why I came. And I am aware that I arrived at the wrong homestead by accident, and that nothing about this was planned or conventional. And I am also aware that I have spent the better part of 3 months being sensible about the fact that I notice every room I am in more acutely when you are in it, and I am frankly tired of being sensible about it." He crossed the space between them without any hesitation at all, with the same unhurried, certain quality he brought to everything physical, and he took her hands, both of them in his, and looked at her and said, "Then let us stop being sensible." The first time he kissed her, it was like the first snow transforming, absolute, the landscape of everything she had known becoming something new and entirely different while remaining essentially itself. They did not move quickly after that, because they were both people who did not move quickly, and because neither of them had any interest in performing a story. They were simply living one, day by day, in the particular texture of a Kansas winter on the frontier, in schoolhouse afternoons and Sunday dinners, and the careful, growing intimacy of two people learning the full shape of each other. He rode into town 3 times a week instead of 1. She began to know his cattle by the names he had given them, which were mostly practical designations rather than names exactly, but which he said with a familiarity that revealed how much of his attention and care they occupied. She brought him books and he read them, and they argued about them with increasing warmth and freedom, and the arguments were one of her favorite things about him, the absolute equality of them, the way he never deferred to her and never dismissed her, and simply engaged her as an equal, which was, she had come to understand, the thing she had always been looking for. He met her school children at Christmas, when he drove her to the school board's holiday gathering with a wagon full of donated supplies for the classroom, and he was terrible with children in the way that people who have never been around them are terrible, stiff, and slightly uncertain. And one of the younger boys, a 6-year-old named Percy who respected no social boundaries, climbed directly onto his lap without invitation and told him extensively about a dog he was hoping to acquire. And Joel sat very still with a look on his face that was somewhere between alarmed and undone, and Alma caught his eyes across the room, and something in both of them shook loose and fell away. He proposed on a Thursday in January, which was not a particularly romantic day of the week, but he was not the kind of man who manufactured romance around the calendar, and she had come to understand that things that happened on Thursdays could be entirely serious. He came to Mrs. Hadley's house after school, which was unusual, and Mrs. Hadley showed him into the parlor and went to get Alma from her room with an expression of transparent satisfaction that she did not try very hard to conceal. Alma came downstairs and found him standing in the parlor with his hat in his hands, and she had seen him in many situations by now, but there was something different in his posture today, something that was not nervousness exactly, but was the quality of a man who has decided something and is committed to it with his whole self. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Then ask it," she said. "I want you to marry me," he said. "Not because you have nowhere else to go, and not because it is practical, and not because of anything except that I love you, Alma. You walked up to my door by accident, and I have spent 4 months being more fully alive than I have been in years, and I do not want to go back to the quiet house. I want you in it. I want to build what we have been building into something permanent. I want—" He stopped, looked at her steadily. "I want to be your partner in this life, every part of it." Alma heard the echo of Henry Bellamy's letter, the phrase that had originally moved her, used now by a man who meant it with a completeness and specificity that those original words had only gestured toward. "Yes," she said. "Joel, yes." He put his hat down on the nearest surface, which happened to be Mrs. Hadley's good side table, and he crossed the room and took her face in his hands with a gentleness that would have surprised anyone who had only seen him splitting wood or working cattle, and kissed her with a thoroughness and feeling that left absolutely no room for further question. Mrs. Hadley, from the hallway. Well, finally. They were married in March of 1874 in the small church 12 miles east, on a Saturday that was cold but brilliantly clear, with a sky so intensely blue over the flat Kansas land that it seemed almost theatrical in its perfection. The church was not full, but it was not empty either. The school families came, and several neighboring ranchers and their wives, and Mrs. Hadley in her best black dress with a face that was the least composed Alma had ever seen it. Alma wore a dress of pale gray wool that she had made herself over the winter evenings, with Mrs. Hadley's coaching and considerably more patience than she had known she possessed, and she carried dried wildflowers from the previous autumn, seed heads and dried grasses in shades of gold and brown, because fresh flowers were not available in Kansas in March, and she had decided that was entirely fine because the dried ones were honest and beautiful and hers. Joel wore his best coat and a clean white shirt and stood at the front of the church with the pastor and watched her walk down the aisle with an expression that Mrs. Hadley later said was the most undisguised thing she had ever seen on a man's face. And Alma, seeing it, felt the particular warmth of being fully known and fully wanted simultaneously. The vows, they said, were the traditional ones, but when the pastor had finished and they were standing face to face with their hands joined, Joel said, very quietly, just for her, "Partner in this life, every part of it, I mean that." "I know you do," she said. "That is why I am here." They moved her things to the Carson property the following day, her trunk and her carpetbag and her collection of books, which turned out to be substantially larger than the space on his small shelf had anticipated, and they spent the first Sunday of their married life rearranging the bookshelf to accommodate both their collections, which required a significant amount of negotiation about organizational logic, and which was, as first days of cohabitation go, entirely characteristic of both of them. The house transformed under her presence in ways that were not dramatic, but were continuous and real. She had an eye for small things, a piece of calico over the cabinet shelf, the rearrangement of the two chairs by the fire to a better angle, the addition of a proper kitchen table cloth. He watched these changes with an expression of quiet pleasure, the way a person looks at a thing becoming more fully what it should have been all along. Spring came with the particular violence and beauty that Kansas spring always carried, thunderstorms that turned the sky green and arrived with a speed and force that still shocked her. And between them days of extraordinary sweetness, the grass coming up, the creek running high and clear, new calves appearing in the field with the wobbly, indignant quality of new life everywhere. She continued to teach. They had discussed it, and the discussion had been brief, because Joel's view was entirely simple. She was a good teacher and the children needed her, and it was her work and her choice, and it would continue to be as long as she wished it to. He drove her to school 3 mornings a week when the weather was bad, and she walked the other days, and the rhythm of it, her work, his work, the evenings together, had the quality of something well made. In May, a letter arrived from Mrs. Whitmore in Cincinnati, the woman who had initially brought the advertisement to Alma's attention, the original unlikely thread that had led to all of this. The letter was warm and curious and slightly guilty in its tone, as if Mrs. Whitmore had been worried for some time that she had inadvertently set Alma on a disastrous course. Alma wrote back. She wrote 3 pages because she could not easily condense what had happened into less, and she found, writing it, that the story was remarkable, the wrong address, the lantern in the dark, the man who was not who she had been coming to find and who had turned out to be, with a specificity and completeness she could not have imagined in advance, exactly who she had needed to find. She read the letter to Joel that evening. He was quiet for a moment at the end of it. "You told her about the argument over my Shakespeare margins," he said. "It is an important detail," she said. "I have opinions," he said. "You have many opinions," she said. "They are one of your better qualities." He looked at her with the warmth that had been growing in his expression all spring, the way the land had been warming, a gradual and genuine and unstoppable thing. "Tell her," he said, "that she should come and visit, if she wants to see for herself what she started." Alma laughed, and the sound of it filled the house in a way she had stopped noticing only because it had become constant, which was itself a kind of miracle. The summer of 1874 was long and hot and extraordinarily productive. The cattle herd grew. The crops she planted in the kitchen garden came up with a vigor that delighted her: tomatoes and squash and beans, and the most defiant row of sunflowers she had ever had the pleasure of watching reach toward the Kansas sky. She hired 2 of the older school children to help her weed on Saturday mornings, and paid them in fresh cornbread and the specific satisfaction of work done well, which their parents all told her afterward was the most reliable payment she could have chosen. Joel expanded the barn in August, with the help of several neighboring ranchers in the cooperative tradition of frontier mutual aid, and Alma organized the food and the water and the logistics of feeding a crew of 8 men for 3 days with a competence that left Joel, watching her from the barn framework, with an expression that was equal parts pride and something softer, more private. Their neighbor to the south, a family named Prater, had a son of 17 who needed work, and Joel took him on as a regular hired hand. A boy named Eli who was quiet and willing, and had a particular gift with horses that Joel recognized and quietly encouraged. Alma taught Eli to read better than he had been doing in the evenings when he stayed for supper, and by autumn he had read entirely through Great Expectations and had opinions about it that were, she told Joel privately, more interesting than some she had heard from adults. "You turn everything into a school," Joel said, not critically. "Yes," she agreed. "It is a character trait." "I know," he said. "I like it." In September, Alma discovered she was pregnant. She told Joel on a Sunday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold in front of her, with the particular directness she brought to every significant thing. She said the words plainly and then watched his face, because his face was always where the truth of him was, however slightly he showed it. What she saw was something she had not seen before, a cracking open of his expression that was absolute and total and beyond his usual careful control, something that was joy in its most unguarded form, so large and immediate that it briefly undid all of his habitual composure, and he put his face in his hands for a moment, and she heard him breathe, and when he looked up his eyes were bright. "Alma," he said, and could not apparently say anything else for a moment. "I know," she said softly. He came around the table and pulled her up and held her with a care that managed simultaneously to be entirely gentle and entirely certain, his arms around her and his face against her hair, and neither of them said anything for a while, and the morning light came through the window and fell on them both, and the house was warm and full and completely, irrevocably theirs. She taught until December, when the walking became difficult in the deep cold, and her condition was advanced enough that Mrs. Hadley, who had appointed herself to a supervisory role in Alma's pregnancy, with the thoroughness she brought to all significant endeavors, declared that the school could manage with the older children leading lessons for a few weeks. The winter was hard, as Kansas winters were, but the house had been improved over the past year, better chinking between the logs, a new stove pipe that drew cleanly, the wool blankets supplemented by a quilt that Alma had spent 3 months making from fabric pieces carefully hoarded since her arrival. The quilt was a record of the year in a way, each fabric carrying a memory, a piece of the gray dress she had worn to the wedding, a square from the calico on the kitchen shelf, a cut from Eli's old shirt that had been worn beyond useful and donated to the cause. She was not afraid of the birth. She was aware of the genuine danger that accompanied birth on the frontier, where doctors were rare and distance was a real enemy, and things went wrong with a frequency that no amount of courage entirely neutralized. She was aware and honest with herself about it, and she had told Joel plainly that she was aware, and he had received that with the same quiet seriousness he gave to everything that mattered, and they had made their practical preparations. Mrs. Hadley, who had attended many births over her years on the frontier, agreed to come when the time arrived, and the doctor in the county seat had been alerted and would come if he was reachable. The baby came in February, on a night that was clear and cold with stars in the Kansas sky that were brutally bright, the way they are in deep winter when the air is completely dry. Mrs. Hadley arrived and took charge with the efficient authority of someone who had done this many times, and lost no one they did not have to lose, and Joel remained where he was permitted to remain, and was otherwise engaged in the specific helpless agony of a man who loves someone very much and cannot do the thing that is needed. It took 7 hours, which Mrs. Hadley said was entirely reasonable for a first, and at the end of it Alma was exhausted in every atom of her body, and more alive than she had ever felt in holding a son. A boy, solid and furious and dark-haired, already bearing in the set of his brow a discernible echo of the man standing in the doorway looking at him, as if the entire meaning of the universe had just clarified itself in one small and extraordinary person. They named him Thomas William Carson, after no one in particular and both of them in general, and he was from his first hour absolutely certain of himself in the way that confident people are, demanding and responsive and fiercely present, and Joel held him that first night with the particular stillness of a man who has understood something important and is trying to be equal to it. "He has your certainty," Alma said, from the bed, watching Joel hold Thomas with a care so thorough it was nearly absurd. "He has your directness," Joel said, not looking up. "He has been staring at me for 10 minutes and I cannot tell if he is approving or not." "He is assessing," Alma said, "like his father." Joel looked at her then with Thomas in his arms and the lamplight on his face and the winter stars outside the window, and said, "I love you," with a simplicity and completeness that was entirely like him, no ceremony, no performance, just the plain and absolute truth. "I love you," she said back. "Also Thursdays are apparently when the important things happen with you." He blinked. "Then it is Saturday." "Is it?" she said, exhausted and happy and slightly delirious. "Well, close enough." Thomas was 6 months old when Dale Mercer returned to the county. Not to the land, that fight was long over, but to the town, with a new scheme and a new lawyer and the specific, unrelenting quality of a man who does not accept that he has been beaten. He had put in a claim at the town level for access rights across Joel's land to a water source further east, arguing that his interests required legal passage. It was a nuisance claim, not a serious one, but nuisance claims in 1875 on the Kansas frontier required real responses, because the law was still being built in real time, and what was ignored had a way of becoming precedent. Joel hired a lawyer from Dodge City, a man named Hessler who had a reputation for thoroughness, and Alma sat at the kitchen table with Hessler and Joel, and went through every document again with the same careful intelligence she had applied 2 years before, and this time Mercer did not even make it to a formal proceeding. Hessler sent a letter, Mercer's lawyer sent a reply, and the claim was abandoned within 3 weeks. Joel told Alma afterward, with a controlled satisfaction that was as close to gleeful as she had ever seen him, "He is going to keep trying." "Let him," Alma said, nursing Thomas at the kitchen table with the absolute composure of a woman who has, over the past 2 years, become entirely unintimidatable. "He will keep losing." He did. Mercer tried twice more over the following 2 years, with diminishing conviction and results, and eventually, sometime in 1877, he appeared to have found easier targets elsewhere and was not seen again in the county. The years between 1875 and 1878 were years of building, in the most literal and comprehensive sense. The herd grew to over 100 head, and Joel hired a second hand, an older man named Bates who had been a trail driver for 20 years and had finally wanted a permanent situation. The kitchen garden became a real kitchen garden, properly fenced and producing enough to put up substantial stores for winter. The house gained a second room in 1876, built over summer with Eli and Bates and several of the neighboring ranchers' hands, which became, as it was intended, a room for Thomas and subsequently for whatever came after Thomas. The school continued, year by year, with the cycle of children growing through it and out the other side into the lives the frontier offered, which were hard and genuine and not without injustice. She taught the children of homesteaders and ranchers, and in 1876, the children of two black families who had come to Kansas on the great Exoduster migration, seeking land and freedom in the West. She taught them alongside everyone else, as she had always taught in Cincinnati. That was the only way she knew to teach, every child equal in the classroom, every mind worth the same effort and attention. And there were people in the community who had objections that they brought to the school board, and she went before that board and said what she believed and what she intended to continue doing, clearly and without apology. And Joel sat in the back of the room and said not a single word until after she had finished, and the board had, with considerable discomfort, agreed to her terms. Walking out of the meeting, he said, "You did not need me in there." "No," she agreed. "But I am glad you were there anyway." His hand found hers briefly in the dark outside the meeting hall, the grip warm and certain and entirely private. "So am I," he said. In the spring of 1877, Alma's school was expanded to a second room, funded by the county and partly by contributions from the community, which she had organized with the patient, relentless competence of a woman who understood how things actually got done in the world. A second teacher was hired to handle the younger children, a young woman from Ohio named Clara Marsh, who was 22 and determined, and slightly overwhelmed by the landscape for the first 3 months until Alma took her firmly in hand. Joel watched Alma mentor Clara with the same quiet attention he gave to anything that revealed a new facet of the person he had been married to for 3 years. And one evening after Clara had left and Thomas was asleep and the house was settled and still, he said, "You know that you have changed this place." Alma looked up from her mending. "What do you mean?" "The school," he said. "The children who have gone through it. The way the town understands what education can be. You walked here by accident and set your roots down, and this place is different because of it." He paused. "I am not saying it very well." "You are saying it perfectly," she said. "I just want you to know that I see it," he said. "All of it, not just us and Thomas. The whole of what you have done here, I see it." She put down her mending and looked at him and was moved by him in the way she had been moved by him reliably for 3.5 years, the way that had not diminished but only grown more specific and more solid. "That means everything to me," she said, "more than I can say." "You do not have to say it," he said. "I know." She had learned by now to receive that in the spirit it was given, the knowledge held between them that did not always require speech, the fluency in each other's silences that was the genuine intimacy of people who have built a real life together. She had been afraid of that, once afraid that silence meant absence, that a man who did not speak was a man who was not present. She knew better now. Joel Carson's silences were full of him. They were where he lived. Their second child came in January of 1878. A girl this time, born in the same bed as Thomas, delivered by Mrs. Hadley with the same efficient authority, arriving in the world with a particularly imperious quality that made Mrs. Hadley, who did not laugh easily, genuinely laugh in the first minutes after the birth. They named her Ruth Eleanor Carson, for no one specific and for the general quality of the name, which felt correct. Ruth had her mother's dark eyes and her father's remarkable stillness. She was a quiet baby, observant and measuring from the earliest days, with a quality of paying attention to the world that Joel recognized, and that made something in his face, watching her, go very soft indeed. Thomas, at 3, received his sister with an initial suspicion that gradually converted to proprietorial devotion over the following months, appointing himself her protector with a conviction that was slightly comic given his size but entirely genuine. 1878 brought good cattle prices and a dry summer that was hard on the garden, but not on the grasses the cattle depended on. And by autumn, they had the best financial position they had yet had, which enabled Joel to do a thing he had been planning for a year. He bought the adjacent 80 acres to the north that had been lying fallow since the family who owned them had pulled up and left in the dry summer of 1876. The acreage gave them access to a better spring and room to expand the herd significantly over the following years. Alma, riding the boundary of the new land with Joel on a Saturday morning in October with Thomas in front of her on the saddle and Ruth, in a pack arrangement on Joel's back that he had constructed with the same practical ingenuity he applied to all physical problems, looked at the expanse of grass and sky, and felt the full, rounded, solid weight of a life that was genuinely and unequivocally hers. "We have 240 acres, she said. "We do," Joel said. "Do you remember what your advertisement said? The one you told me Henry Bellamy had written?" She had seen a copy of it in her first month here, through Mrs. Hadley. 160 acres of good Kansas grassland, he said. "We have outdone that considerably," she said. He looked at her sideways, and the corner of his mouth moved, and his eyes held the afternoon light, and she thought, not for the first or last time, of the night she had walked up to his door in the dark, exhausted and disoriented and without any plan for what she had arrived at, and he had held the lantern up and she had seen his face and known, not known yet, not consciously, not in any way she could have named, but known in the way that the body registers things before the mind does. Some quality of recognition that had no logical basis, but that 3.5 years of marriage had entirely vindicated. She had arrived at the wrong homestead. The stagecoach driver had pointed her in the wrong direction in the dark, and she had walked 3 miles through a Kansas October night to a door that was not the one she had been aiming for, to a man who was not who she had arranged to meet, and everything about it had been an accident and a mistake and a wrong turn, and it had been the rightest thing that had ever happened to her. She had thought, in those first bewildering moments in the lantern light, that this was a catastrophe. She had thought in the following weeks that it was a complication. It had been, in fact, the thing her life had been building toward from the moment she had left her father's Pennsylvania farm and set out into the world with her trunk and her books and her particular combination of practicality and hunger for something real. "What are you thinking?" Joel asked, with the ease of a man who has been asking that question for years and has learned to recognize the specific quality of quiet that preceded it. "I am thinking about lanterns," she said. He was quiet for a moment, then, "You walked a long way in the dark." "I know," she said, "but the light was yours." He reached across the space between their horses and found her hand, and held it, and they rode that way for a while, the two of them and their children, over the new acreage, in the October afternoon, with the sky enormous and the grass gold and the silence between them full of everything it had always been full of. In the spring of 1879, Clara Marsh, who had by now firmly found her footing in the Kansas landscape, and in the school told Alma that she intended to marry Eli, the young man who had started as Joel's hired hand and was now, at 23, a skilled ranch hand with prospects of his own. Alma looked at the two of them together with a satisfaction that had nothing proprietary about it and everything celebratory. "He reads well now," Alma said to Joel that evening. "He does," Joel said. "You taught him." "He taught himself," she said. "I just gave him the books." "There is a philosophy of education in that distinction," Joel said. "There is a philosophy of most things in most distinctions," she said, "if you look at them right." He smiled, a real smile, the kind that had become more frequent over 5 years together, The kind she thought had been there all along underneath the careful surface, waiting for someone to make the conditions for it. She loved that smile with a specific, deep, lasting love that had only grown with familiarity. The wedding for Clara and Eli was in May, in the same church where Joel and Alma had married, and Alma stood beside Joel in the second row with Ruth on her hip and Thomas beside Joel, and watched two young people begin the same kind of life she and Joel had built, and felt the full, generous warmth of knowing that good things could propagate, that they could be passed forward, that a life lived with integrity and care made a kind of heat that other lives could lean toward. In the summer of 1879, Alma wrote a long letter to the Ohio State Teachers Association, an organization she had joined through correspondence, about the experience of frontier education, the challenges and the particular satisfactions, the unique requirements of a school that served children of wildly different backgrounds and preparation, the specific injustices she had encountered, and the ways she had navigated them. The letter was published in their quarterly journal, and she received 3 responses from other frontier teachers, and those responses became correspondences, and those correspondences became a small network of women teaching in isolated communities across the West, sharing strategies and materials, and the particular solidarity of people doing difficult work in difficult conditions. Joel read the published letter in the journal copy that arrived by post and sat with it for a while and said nothing immediately, which meant he was taking it seriously. Then he said, "You should teach teachers." "I am a school teacher," she said, "not a professor." "You could be," he said. "If that is something you want, things are changing. The territorial normal schools are hiring." She looked at him. "That would mean a great deal of additional work." "Everything worth doing does," he said. "I am asking if it is something you want, not asking you to sacrifice it for anything here." This was who he was. This was the promise he had made at the beginning and had kept without exception, a partner in this life, every part of it. Her ambitions not caged by his comfort, her work not subordinated to his convenience, her full self always the entirety of what he had chosen and continued to choose. "Not yet," she said. "Thomas is 7 and Ruth is 2, and the school here needs me for a few more years. But someday, maybe." "Whenever you want," he said. "I will be here." The decade turned. Thomas grew into a serious, book-loving, stubbornly honest boy who showed every sign of being a person his parents would be proud of and occasionally exasperated by in equal measure. Ruth grew into a girl of extraordinary perception, and a will that was, as Mrs. Hadley noted at Ruth's 6th birthday with a tone of pure delight, exactly what this family deserves. There was a third child, a boy they named James, born in 1882, who came into the world with the maximum possible argument about it, and then immediately became the most cheerful person in the household, a disposition that appeared to surprise his parents and delight his older siblings. The Carson property continued to grow, not extravagantly but steadily, in the way that good work compounded over years tends to. The herd was healthy. The land was cared for with the specific, ongoing attention of people who understood that land was not a resource to be extracted, but a living system to be worked with. Joel hired a third hand in 1883, a middle-aged man named Torres whose family had been in Kansas long before the homesteaders came, and who knew the land and the seasons with an intimacy that Joel immediately recognized and respected. Mrs. Hadley remained in town, aging with the same ferocity with which she had done everything else, still managing her boarding house, still appearing at inconvenient moments in doorways with observations that were accurate enough to be slightly uncanny. She and Alma had developed over the years a friendship that was somewhat improbable, the sharp-edged frontier widow and the schoolteacher from Pennsylvania, but which had the quality of all genuine friendships, which is that the people involved had seen each other clearly and chosen each other anyway. When Mrs. Hadley's health began to decline in the winter of 1884, Alma drove to town 3 times a week and sat with her, and brought her books, and argued with her about things that did not need to be argued about and agreed with her about things that did, and Joel came with her when the situation was serious, and when Mrs. Hadley died in February of 1885, in her own bed, on her own terms, with Alma holding her hand. She had arranged to leave her boarding house to Alma to do with as she saw fit. Alma turned the boarding house into an accommodation for female teachers coming to work in the county, a place where women arriving alone in an unknown landscape would find a room that was waiting for them, clean and warm, with someone who understood the particular experience of arriving somewhere strange and being met with unexpected kindness. Joel, when she told him the plan, said nothing for a moment. Then, "You are turning the house into the thing that helped you when you arrived." "Yes," she said. "That is exactly what you should do with it," he said. In 1886, Alma began teaching summer intensive sessions for frontier teachers from the broader region, drawing on the correspondence network she had built over the years and the normal school connection she had developed. She was 40 by then, and Joel was 42, and their lives had a fullness and a richness that was entirely the product of years of real work and genuine love and the steady accumulation of things that matter. Thomas, at 12, was already talking about the land in the way that Joel had always talked about it, not as inheritance but as responsibility, as something requiring understanding and long-term care. Ruth, at 9, was demonstrating an inclination toward medicine that Alma was already thinking about with strategic seriousness, because the barriers between women and medicine were real and significant and would require careful navigation, and early preparation was the only real answer to that kind of obstacle. James, at 4, was entirely and blissfully unaware of anyone's strategic plans for him, and was primarily occupied with the dog Copper. The dog Henry Bellamy had mentioned in his letters had died years ago, but Joel had acquired a new dog, a sheepdog mix named Bram, who had become James's sworn companion and co-conspirator in every adventure the property offered. One September evening in 1887, Alma and Joel sat on the porch of their house, expanded now, with a covered porch that ran the full front length, added in 1881, and the sun went down over the Kansas prairie in the way it went down, which was always extraordinary, the light long and golden, and the sky moving through colors that no painter had ever fully captured, and the silence was of the kind that contained everything. 13 years, Joel said. He was not a man who usually marked time in this way, which meant he had been thinking about it. 13 years, she agreed. "Do you ever think about it?" he said. "The night you arrived." "Sometimes," she said. "I think about what I would have thought then if I had known." "What would you have thought?" She considered this honestly, as she considered everything honestly. "I would not have believed it," she said. "Not that it was possible to have this. Not that I had walked to the right place by accident." She paused. "I would have thought it was too large for me to trust." "And now," he said. She turned and looked at him in the fading light. This man who had held a lantern up in a dark doorway and let her in without condition, who had been exactly what he appeared to be from the first night to this one, who had never given her a reason to doubt what was real. "Now," she said, "I know that I walked 3 miles in the wrong direction and arrived at the right door, and I know that the light was yours and was always going to be yours, even when I did not know your name." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I am not afraid of how large it is. It is just the size of my life. It is the right size." His arm came around her, easy and certain and warm. Below the porch, the last light gilded the grass. In the house behind them, their children were various stages of getting ready for bed. Thomas reading past his allowed hour, Ruth asking questions of the dark, James already asleep with Bram's warm weight against his feet. "Partner in this life," Joel said softly. "Every part of it," she said. The night deepened and the stars came out, enormous and bright over the Kansas plains, the same stars she had navigated by that first night without knowing where they were taking her, the same sky that had watched her walk toward a lantern in the dark and find everything she had been looking for in the face of a stranger at the wrong door. The right door. There had never been any other door. There had only been the dark, and the distance, and the light he was holding, waiting without knowing he was waiting, and her walking toward it with everything she owned, and everything she was, and the absolute necessity of warmth. She had arrived, she had stayed, she had built something real and lasting and wholly, completely hers. The lantern had long since been set down. They did not need it anymore. The house behind them was full of light.